This may be a slightly different kind of presentation, and I'm not sharing a text, but I will try to speak slowly and clearly. And it will also be a more casual kind of personal narrative, more maybe than standard kind of philosophical exegesis. Partly this comes from just my own interest, which, as I say, comes from media and film and images. And my interest in Nakai really kind of came out of that. And one of the things that I sort of found interesting about him, as initially what I thought of as kind of a film theorist, is that he had these kind of enormous sprawling histories and ideas within which he placed film. And it seemed to give it a kind of a lot of richness, even when he's talking about something, fairly small around film. So I was trying to think about this, and I wrote I initially researched him for my dissertation many years ago, and then I'm kind of revised that. And I want to begin by kind of going back to that argument, because I hadn't looked at Nakai Masakazu for at least 10 years before I got the invitation to come here. And so this is just kind of my my effort to kind of go back and regroup a little bit and think about it. And then from there, I'll try to develop some kind of new thoughts a little bit. I'm interested especially in ideas of life, so this might relate a little bit to Steve's presentation, but particularly in relationship to media and how these are increasingly kind of enmeshed together. And partly my question is sort of whether or not addressing Nakai's thought can help us think through that. And I wanted to sort of respond as well to the conference or workshop, which is to ask what it means to read Nakai now. And partly I have to admit, I'm very skeptical from my perspective as a media person to think, okay, well, so much has changed. What does it mean for me to read this kind of media criticism, film theory kind of thing now? So I don't know how much I will get through, but I will try to pursue those ideas. When I did write the essay, the original title of the essay was The Cinematic Imperative, Nakai Masakazu and the Responsibility of Cinema. And that title might sound a little bit odd. First of all, what cinematic responsibility doesn't probably make a whole lot of sense. And also it makes Nakai sound like a kind of moral philosopher. And for all the terms that are used to describe his thinking and work, aesthetician, media theorist, librarian, filmmaker, anti-fascist, and so on, moral philosopher is not typically among them, I don't think. Although Imamura Taihei does write about him as kind of using a sort of moral idea, but mostly by this he means his commitment to the masses and his optimism, and that's kind of like his moral. But I took this in a little bit different direction. Nakai did not, to the best of my knowledge, write extensively in a more conventional mode about political philosophy around something like the state, for example, sovereignty, the emperor system, something along these lines. And while he's commonly called an anti-fascist, he didn't write analytically or critically about fascism in the same way that someone like Hosaka Jun did, for example. So it seems more rooted, I guess, kind of in the activities that he conducted than in the content of his critiques or ideas, although for sure, of course, they do intersect. And it was those activities, obviously, that got him arrested as well, kind of as an editor. But my idea in terms of thinking about responsibility comes from someplace else. It was prompted by his essays on cinematic space and cinematic time. Those essays, as I'm sure many of us know, they are the last two sections in the first half of Bigaku Nyumon. And, but those did not appear there for the first time. In fact, they first appeared as separate essays, Cinematic Space, Eiga no Kukan, and the subsequent Cinematic Time, Eiga no Jikan, in the July and September issues, see if this works, of the journal Eiga Geijutsu in 1946. So I think these were maybe among Nakai's first post-war writings, very early. And when they first appeared, they have a subtitle, and it's going to be a little bit hard to read, but it's Eiga no shitaise no mondai ni kanren shite, with regard to the question of cinematic subjectivity. And I found this pretty interesting. And I'll come back to space and time, but I want to address that because when these essays appear in Bigaku Nyumon, that subtitle is gone. And he no longer mentions anything about cinematic subjectivity. And so as I was writing it and thinking about this kind of moment and the context of it, one of the things that I thought about is the relationship between subjectivity and responsibility. And Victor Koshman's work, for example, in kind of analyzing sort of debates around subjectivity and responsibility in post-war Japan, puts a lot of attention on this idea. And in Koshman's work, he basically, of course, he does not mention Nakai Masakazu at all. And his conclusion is largely that those debates were fruitless, that they reached an impasse, and they found themselves back in the pre-war time, really. And so one of the things that I thought was that perhaps, Nakai was maybe thinking about the ways that cinema could speak to ideas of responsibility in a different kind of way. So in this sense, because there were these debates, right, that Koshman talks about, and that people in film were also talking about a little bit, like Itami Mansaku's ideas of kind of the responsibility of the deceived. This is, to the best of my knowledge, we were talking earlier about whether film writing ever had a bigger impact in Japan. And Itami's essay might be one of those places where Damasareta Mono no Sekinin, I think, did have slightly maybe more reach a little bit. But even if we could acknowledge these, why is that significant? Partly, I think it's that, because Nakai saw the emergence of cinematic space and time in light of his kind of larger arguments about the dissolution of individuals and individualism, and the rise of a new kind of collectivism that posited the end of the observer or Kantian subject. This raises all kinds of questions. Not only did aesthetic philosophy fail to grasp this dimension insofar as it turned away from cinema and mass culture as he saw it, as a kind of non-art, but it's clear that the mainstream of philosophy also failed. As Steve said in his presentation too, and has come up, according to Nakai, Nishida, for example, never really produced a response to Tanabe Hajime's critique, and never really produced a theory of mediation. And I would agree that I think actually Nishida did respond to that to some extent, but this is Nakai's, that's his kind of critique. So if it's the case that the world of individualism has dissolved, what would responsibility then look like? Because we usually understand those terms right through some kind of individual thing, and not through something that is collective. And so I thought this was kind of an interesting idea, and what might cinema offer as grounds for imagining this? But I also think it's not just about this particular moment. 5 years later, he articulated this problem clearly when he wrote about a crisis of contemporary aesthetics that established a task for film theory. I believe this is the only time he used the word film theory, eiga riron. No longer driven by the terms of responsibility, necessarily the crisis was deeper than that moment and instead touched on the 20th century as a whole and possibly beyond. And obviously he was writing about this already from the early 1930s. So it was a consistent kind of issue. And one of the questions that I have and want to think about in terms of the present is whether that's actually still an issue for us. Are we still in the crisis of a dissolution of individualism? And what kind of collectivities do we have now? And how does that relate to kind of contemporary media? That said, I don't think that Nakai actually posed an answer to this question, at least not directly. Cinema doesn't offer an answer in terms of the history of its images, at least for Nakai. We could think of Jean-Luc Godard's Histoire du Cinéma, for example, which did actually try to put together a sprawling kind of analysis and history of cinema's complicity in fascism and wartime, for example. But for Nakai, actually, he never discussed images. And I find this a very striking thing for somebody who supposedly is a film theorist and a media theorist, is that he didn't really discuss images. Sometimes, yes, in the mid-1930s, he began kind of writing these sort of reviews, but they don't really get into images. And that analysis is very, very different than the kinds of things that he was writing in cinematic space and time, or the absent copula and some of his more famous ideas in cinema. But it's clear that even if it wasn't an answer, that he was trying to sort of intimate the problems that come from failing to address these pressing issues from an appropriate perspective, from a contemporary perspective that was engaged in kind of everyday life and everyday world, sort of kind of practical and maybe embodied experience. And that, he saw cinema as one possibility for this, a kind of democratic practice, and so on. So I begin kind of with this and want to ask again, like kind of what it means to read him today. So if that's a particular sort of historical moment, how we might understand this now. And as I say, I'm a little bit sort of skeptical, or I was really unsure about this. And it doesn't mean that I think we just have to understand him only in terms of his utility, of his ideas, and how they can be applied or something like that. Obviously, there's many, many ways of reading him in kind of contemporary terms. And I've learned a ton over the last couple of days from all of these. But I do think that partly, as I say, my hesitation comes from my interest in media and film. And we might begin from the fact that film is just not the dominant medium anymore at all. In fact, there's no longer a dominant medium, I think a lot of people would say. And we could go further and actually say, as some people do, we live in a post-medium condition. Or other people use the term post-cinema, for example, to describe this. There's lots of different elements to these claims, and I can't address them all, but I do want to address them a little bit in terms of a kind of media-life relationship. Since the implication is partly with this shift in the prior cinematic regime, our life worlds themselves have undergone a significant change, or we are now undergoing one. If we've entered some kind of new relationship to media, what is that? There are, of course, lots of technical changes, and some of the technological changes, and some of these might feel small or kind of petty or just technical things. But within the frameworks that Nakai, or the way he thought, I think they become much bigger. And some of these are very familiar. The shift from analog to digital would be a huge one, for example, right? This is really, really big. Others would include things like the end of continuity as film's operative grammar. For so many years, continuity defined narrative film at the very least. It became the basis for the emergence of film studies as a way of critiquing those ideas of continuity. It connected it with ideas of psychoanalysis and structuralism and so on. So the end of that as a defining rule of cinema, once we have a kind of digital world, changes things considerably, right? And the ideas of cinematic space and cinematic time then may no longer apply. At the same time, the attenuation or evaporation of physical support that once gave the idea of medium its concrete expression is also significant. So with things like television or video, there isn't anything material anymore. There's just an electronic signal, right? That's all. And so it's actually Rosalind Krauss who points to this in her analysis of video as a kind of aesthetics of narcissism. It no longer has an actual kind of medium. We now are in a post-medium condition. Part of that shift to the digital is the loss of the index, to borrow the Peircean term, right? So no longer has a relationship to truth. That idea was so important to Nakai. Obviously, the ability of cinema to record something precisely, even if it feels maybe in hindsight somewhat naive, there's something very important about that, and many people addressed it for a long time. Insofar as he focused so heavily, like in Logic of the Committee, on the role of lies, for example, and the idea that cinema could provide an element of truth to a population completely alienated at that time by all the lying, the loss of that could be significant as well. We can go on. The media mix and convergence that takes specific works and puts them into general contents. The rise of platforms, which work to extract data for profit and blur lines between play, work, and learning, subjecting all of us to endless surveillance. This also suggests that collective seeing, maybe the most important thing, is no longer the default mode of watching. And so if Mirukoto is so important to him, and that idea of a kind of collectivity and way of seeing that is both about kind of ourselves or camera lenses and the ways that those kind of populate different institutions, this is a very, very different experience. And then finally, the claim that cinema is now just a branch of animation. And I mention that because I'm going to try to come back to that kind of at the end. So these are just a few of the ways that I think this has been addressed. And a shift from kind of medium to post-medium that point to some sort of new world, right? But if so, does that mean that the larger fundamental argument that Nakai made about this shift in logic from individual to collective has changed? This feels less clear to me. I'm not sure. The achievement of individualism, as he pointed out, was already a hard-won battle and involved, as he says, lots of violence, throwing off the heavy chains. It's a very kind of tumultuous, sort of experience. Are we at a point now, 100 years later, after he began writing on this topic, where some kind of collective has come into being, or is there something else? So as I'll kind of argue or try to address, one of the important things about cinema, I think, for him was arguably that it provided a sort of site of passage from one logic to the next. And I think that this complicates cinema as a thing or something specific, and raises questions like what kind of logic is operating now, what kinds of subjectivity is born, what are the forces at work that enable or contain these, how do they speak to the conditions of life today? It would be foolhardy, I think, to look to Nakai for answers to all of these questions, but I do think that some of his writings still speak to these. So I want to return to these ideas of cinematic space and time, particularly through the frame of what he called a living space, ikiteru kukan. I might get into trouble here a little bit, also from the discussion yesterday about the ways that when we do engage problems of life, there's always a threat of eugenics and Nazism that are going to be tied into these. But I think that's not a reason to dismiss it. Still a reason all the more probably to get into it. And with things like the pandemic and biopolitics, these become even more pressing and even more fraught. Nakai himself never wrote, as far as I know, an extended essay on life as something like Seime. The same year that Logic of the Committee came out, Nishida wrote, Logic and Life, of course, Onito Seime. But for example, in the 1931 essay, Geijutsu no Ningen Taki Kosatsu, a humanistic inquiry into the arts, he begins with a reflection on Heidegger and what grants human beings privilege or priority in the world of beings, and goes on to quote Fritz Heinemann, who argues that philosophy moves from Geist to Leben and then from Leben to existence. And sorry for my pronunciation because I don't speak German, but that life is already at that level playing this role. But he continues to pursue this in the post-war through other terms, including the idea of living space or ikiteru kukan, as he says, a prelude to a theory of cinematic space. The idea of cinematic space as an expression, though, is already misleading because it suggests that the space is an attribute of cinema. And I don't think that in his writing it is. It would point to the ways that cinema uses or explores space through images, but as I mentioned, Nakai doesn't address images at all. It's not about the representation of space or space in cinema somehow. One of the things that I think makes his writing, peculiar from the standpoint of his status as a film theorist is he didn't talk about images. And so if the image is not a problem, then what is it and where do we start to talk about this kind of space? And I would say it's here, just the blank screen. And he addresses numerous times in his early essays the blank canvas and the blank screen repeatedly, right? Something between me and myself. A living space maybe begins here, a site for projection that people would rarely actually see in a theater because typically it would be masked by curtains and there would be a projected image on top of it as soon as those curtains open. Why is it, he asked, that human beings are dissatisfied with the reflection of their own portrait in a mirror and take, rather than hanging a canvas? Why aren't they satisfied by the pleasure of seeing alone, but rather must convert this into a pleasure of depicting? He had, as I said, long written about this blank canvas, and perhaps even the blank wall of Utsusu might be another sort of form of this. In his discussion of Oscar Becker, we'll come back to this as well, but drawing in this case on mathematics rather than aesthetics, Nakai picks up the essay, The A Priori Structure of Intuitive Space, in which Becker points to the dimensionality of space as something that is composed above purely human physics. Maybe this is his Nazism, and I don't know Becker, so you'll have to help me out with that. This dimensionality is something that Nakai locates in Japanese expressions of space, time, like ma. But he also dives into life aspects of it, or he also uses the expression seimei teki kukan. So he's using a number of different expressions, ikiteru kukan, ikeru kukan, seimei teki kukan. And I don't know that these are all the same exactly, but still speaking to this kind of idea, maybe. The provisional idea he draws is that life does not exist within space, but rather space spreads within life. Physical space is a shadow of life space. Spatial art is thus projected within life as the shadow of this thrownness. While not biological and perhaps not quite standard vitalism, maybe closer to a kind of life form, this still sounds like it's treading on dangerous ground. The two-dimensionality of the canvas is constituted by the space of life, he wrote. Within the visuality of thrownness, when distance, position, or maybe orientation and range are determined, the projecting visuality possesses a two-dimensionality. In this way, the two-dimensionality of the canvas is not the two-dimensionality of physics, but rather can be thought of as, which is the extreme face of the cut, kyokugen no setsudanmen. I don't know how to translate that, and those words are tricky for me. I'm not sure what that is. In which a kind of fallen time inserts itself moment by moment with the shift from thrownness to active projection. So in that kind of idea of utsusu. The canvas can be considered as the shadow of the living space, he says. And in that case, ikeru kukan. Romlichkeit in sein, right? And he says the canvas or screen then forms a question mark posed within the endless flow of time. So the language here is a little bit tricky for me, but the basic impulse feels clear enough. The question posed, one of reflection and of projection, of utsusu, of how we relate to ourselves within a broader world, stands out. This blank question is an expression of uncertainty and anticipation, but it can only be this way if it isn't painted in, projected onto, or turned into an image. In his essay on the living space of cinema, he calls this a mediation without a mediator, or mubaikai no baikai. This mediation without a medium avoids returning, he says, to older Kantian expressions of formal space, keishiki kukan, instead offering a new dialectical theory of space that cinema must take up. And I feel like whenever he's addressing cinema, it's often about a task that it must confront rather than an analysis of sort of what it means. The emphasis on space and time via cinema, otherwise unavailable to us, is something that we also see in his essay on Mikhail Kaufman's Spring, and might be tied to a broader reflection beyond just the avoidance of images, which is that he doesn't address cinema as a thing or a medium as a thing, or even as a work. Like if we think about like Heidegger's origin of the work of art, it goes from thing, where it's form content, into a sort of work. Rather, it seems like a site of passage through which these larger tectonic plates or epistemes shifted. If we want to grasp this monumental transformation, rerouting the place of the human altogether, possibilities of politics and ideas of art, cinema could be useful because it enacts and stages this process, not for any particular elements of its images, genres, directors, or styles. That he was not pursuing art or cinema as a thing also gives us pause in terms of some elements of medium specificity. He focuses a lot on lenses, and celluloid, of course. And so when we read this from a media perspective, people usually understand it in terms of its medium specificity, the lens of film, this kind of idea. But then when he actually gets into it, he goes much further than that to talk about the companies that produce it: Eastman, Agfa, Pathé, Rolex. And then the types of film: 9.5 millimeter, 16, 35 millimeter, positive, negative, reversal, panchromatic, all of which affect the strength of light and shadow in their own ways and possess their own functions, as well as constituting a collective function, a standard that cannot be controlled at the individual level. And so at each and every step and with each kind of component, behind it, there are infinite numbers of activities, of ideas, of materials, of committees making these kinds of decisions. So what kind of specificity is that? What kind of medium is that? He argued that the lens was the foundation upon which the new collective act of seeing was balanced, but the lens itself is already caught up within these further acts and ideas. There's a materiality of the lens, but there's something more fundamental than that material element. And that kind of tension, I think, and thinking about life in those terms is what I'm interested in and kind of trying to pursue. It seems like there's a kind of contradiction here around a blank canvas or screen as a site of mediation rather than image. So if cinema is a living space, not a thing, how do we understand this? Partly, I think that this echoes the ideas from logic of the committee. And in Steve's presentation, he read this. I'm taking his own translation for this. Logic always plays a peculiar role in the crisis that ensues and the collapse of one system and the reorganization by something else. That is, we see that logic itself turns out to be a living ratio in the rupture. It proves to be its own mediation. When we look at the diagrams that he made for the logic of the committee, initially, it looks like it's a history that's kind of unfolding, right? That begins in ancient culture, then goes through medieval culture, modern culture. Obviously, it's a complex arrangement, and I can't begin to do it justice. But I've just always been struck by the fact that all of it is part of the practice of the committee, and maybe could be understood not solely as a kind of teleology, but as a present and a set of kind of practices. And it also seems when we look at that as if each of those kind of epistemes is its own container. But what's interesting, I think, is the space in between them and the transition from one to another. When Nakai writes about this, and I'll just take one example, he writes in this essay, as a result of the development of transportation and a sudden rise in commercial trade, the technique of paper and printing spread everywhere, which began to radically change the linguistic meaning of contemplation. The fact that the most patient observers of the stars began the scientific observation of things with a telescope as a weapon. In the word of contemplation, we have created a skeptical, observant, lonely individual person in the universe, a viewer. It was during the 16th century, that is, during the Renaissance, that the meaning of subjectum turns from something that lies at the foundation, that is, as what denotes the embodied subject, to something that observes, an epistemological subject. Reading this and having that kind of density of relationships at all these levels actually kind of makes me think of someone like Raymond Williams and the ways that he writes about television as a different kind of way of thinking about this. Cinema still seemed to be more of a site of transition rather than something that happens within a kind of episteme. And it's through this that we could see the sort of dissolution that I've talked about. So while a diagram might not be the best expression of passage or metamorphosis, just as a lens or blank canvas helps bring into focus those forces and changes that were otherwise invisible, the sprawling logic here with its attendant social forms, modes of expression, and so on, do point maybe to a kind of practice. In that sense, all of those things are kind of at work. When I began thinking about this, I thought like, okay, so how do we understand the feudal system if this is supposed to be a depiction of the present? But then when he talks about universities and the production of knowledge, he basically says you have the reproduction of the feudal system within a university system itself, with people protecting their fiefdoms, driven by some kind of either petty arguments or just self-advancement. And so it retains that element even within kind of a present structure. Nonetheless, I think as I sort of thinking about the ways that we go from one to another, takes me to an idea of movement and transformation that I think is important, and that brings me closer to ideas of animation. The idea of transformation and change in relation to a living space of cinema can draw us closer to animation in contemporary terms as the primary logic of moving images within a post-medium condition. It's also the place where contemporary film philosophy has tended to explore the relationship between media and life. It's curious to me that Nakai did not write about animation. There could be a lot of different reasons for that, and Imamura Taihei, who was influenced by him, did write quite brilliantly, maybe one of the world's first full critical books on animation, Manga Eigaron. But as far as I know, Nakai never wrote on it, even though, of course, it uses lens, it uses film. So I want to draw a little bit on the ideas and writings of a couple people who do address this. Shane Denson with his idea of discorrelated images, and Deborah Levitt with her concept of an animatic apparatus. Let's see if I can. So for Levitt, for example, she's one thing that's important about their discussions of animation is that they're not really about drawn figures put into movement, a certain genre or medium or something like that. And instead, they refer to a kind of ground. And these are things that are happening in sciences as well, right? A transformation of biology from the scientific study of being into a technology of doing, building, and engineering. Both life and death have been recalibrated. The ability to create transgenic sheep with human DNA, to cross a fish with a strawberry, or to patent genetic markers using fluorescent proteins from deep sea creatures transforms biology from the study of natural history into a set of interventions or techniques. So she's citing this work on kind of biosciences and basically linking animation, with it as an art form, but also as a way to reflect. So animation, she basically says that cinema still belongs to ontology, but with animation, it's no longer attached to ontology. And she uses the term anthology to describe this. So there is no death in animation because there's no being, no existence to begin with. There are no necessary limiting features, essential finitude. Everything is shadowed by its possible metamorphosis, erasure, and resurrection, and thus there is no ontology. So in the ways that she's writing about this, I do feel like there are connections in terms of a kind of living space with how Nakai writes, even though he's writing about cinema. And maybe because he's not addressing images per se, but kind of the ground of them in a living space, we can draw these kinds of connections. And one more person that I'll address is Shane Denson. And he's kind of talking about, he uses the term discorrelated images to talk about contemporary cinema. And partly the term itself is intended to speak to the critique of correlationism and in the way that post-cinema might intervene in those discussions around speculative philosophy, but I'll set those aside. For him, contemporary images are subject to microprocesses, like think of things like buffering, for example, where there's temporal mechanisms going on, but we don't actually see them when we're watching the images. Nonetheless, we are shaped by them affectively. And his writing in this way is, I think, about trying to recall earlier theories of the gaze, but recast those through the body. We're a kind of pre-conscious set of technological operations through which images are processed directly and without mediation steal into viewers and shape them. So it becomes a way of talking about control effectively. And the body becomes a site of that in this case. So he says the fembot that we see in Ex Machina, the image that I just showed, mediates the generative activity that intercedes between the image's production and reception, that inserts itself between perception or recording and action or playback, thus giving form to the affective interface where the viewer's living body intersects with an image endowed with Bergsonian duration, animated with something like life itself, in a microtemporal interval between technical and biological input-output circuits. A lively space of affective materiality and exchange is activated in this interval, such that post-cinematic images insinuate themselves into the anthropotechnical circuits that constitute the environment for living, entering not just as image objects, but in fact anticipating the act of perception, preceding the arrival of the constituted molar subject who might perceive them. So this is already something kind of prior to a subject. And if I just look at this kind of rhetoric and the thinking, again, I feel like it's not hard to see in a number of different kind of ways, connections that could be drawn with Nakai, but it still raises this kind of question of whether or not the two living spaces are the same. And I don't think that they are. And so there's multiple kind of layers going on. And this I haven't kind of worked my way through, but I'm going to just stop here and say thank you. And yes.
Yeah, I have a question that is more curiosity than a question itself because I'm not familiar with Nakai. So I really enjoy your presentation and the multiple directions that you try to unpack and discuss. And I was wondering if Nakai wrote about death and media or death and cinema. Because when you were discussing when you open up to animation and you mentioned another reference to and you mentioned reference and where in the reference says that in animation you don't have that.
Right.
I was thinking immediately to Jean Cocteau's take on cinema and the death at work. And so I was thinking that maybe I don't know, there must be something in Nakai's writings. I'm not sure about that because as I said, I'm not familiar with his work, but because I think it would be interesting, like to tie to reinforce your take on Nakai as you presented today.
There's no, as far as I know, and someone else here may know better, there's no direct reference to it. He does talk about like anxiety in a kind of a Heideggerian sense that would seem to be maybe mobilized by that, but there's no direct reference to death that I know of. Yeah, does he ever talk about death, Nakai?
About death as
Death and cinema, death and
or even just
media,
general, not that I know.
no. Yeah, I was like,
okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was at the same time profound and easy to understand. So
Good.
And
But it was easy at least, yeah.
thank you. I would like to recollect a little bit when you were talking at the beginning of your presentation that when you said that nowadays we don't have cinema anymore, we only have animation, right? Or at least we don't have live action cinema anymore. Does it also refer to, or were you also referring to how contemporary cinema is basically all like computer generated images? That's what you meant, right?
Yeah, that argument comes from Lev Manovich, and he basically says, cinema is born by sort of distancing itself from animation, and then it works to preserve its own space. It banishes animation, only to find itself becoming one branch of animation in the end. As digital cinema kind of emerges and develops, and it's based on compositing. So essentially all cinema now is a form of animation. And even if you have film, it's just one layer within the composite. So effectively, of course, people can still shoot something on 35 millimeter film or 16 millimeter film, and they do. But generally speaking, the vast majority, and where I live, it's impossible to see something on film. Everything is digital.
Doesn't exist.
Yeah. So in that sense, that's what I mean by that. So, in Levit's case, for example, she uses Oshimamoru as her kind of sample, but as I sort of suggested, it's not that. I think it's a useful example, but it doesn't indicate for her what animation is. And yes, I think it is in terms of kind of the whole range of cinematic production today, or whatever it is, medium production.
I understand. Because, even though we use the word film, it's not film anymore.
Right.
It's not film, right? Yeah. And also what I. So of course, it is also included in this idea that there's no live action cinema anymore, only animation.
Right.
But also like whenever we watch basically any like contemporary film, or at least the blockbusters, like you have like one actor like on the screen, and then everything else is just like computer generated imagery, right? And very often even the actors, right, they are not even there. Like they use like what is it called, like deep fake or something, like to make their faces, so it's not even live action anymore, right? It's all animation, right?
Yeah. So almost everything is done post-production, basically, right? Yeah.
So for Nakai, it wouldn't even be film anymore. I mean, you were talking that he doesn't say anything about animation, right? So we don't know his opinion on animation, right?
Yeah, I think because he's not. The inclination I think is is to read him as somebody who's talking about film and its specificity. And I'm trying to trouble that idea a little bit and open up to thinking about it as, possibly applying to a broader, kind of contemporary media condition. Conflating the two seems like a problem, not just because of the technical kind of factors, but historical and other sort of things. And especially, I think, still in light, I do think I mean, this is also why I was asking about the idea of the individual and Nakai and the post-war, because people continue to sort of either attack a sort of liberal subject of some kind, or something along these lines. But to me, the way that when I read Nakai's post-war works, they feel like they're kind of pans to democracy in some kind of way. And that collective doesn't feel like it's sort of materialized exactly. And I don't know if I think in general about how he understands a collective, it feels like it could be a lot of different sort of things. Maybe that's still an application, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, that feels like a bigger question about communities and things like that, and forms of social organization. Yeah. Yeah, there's a media side of it, and then there's, just the social, political side, yeah.
I put a very naive question, but you, Felipe, you said there is no film anymore because the material, but if we consider film cinematography, so we have moving images. So why? Where is the problem?
No, I was just talking about the how it is almost
Irony.
ironic. We call it film.
In
It's
this
not-
sense. Oh, okay.
It's not film right anymore. But actually, what Philip is saying is that even if we use film to project the thing, since it's all digital nowadays, right? So it's
Mostly, yeah. I mean, if you're in Tokyo, you can watch, an actual film, and you can watch it, the theater in Nagoya closed, right?
we have the Sakai
Ascoli one,
Yeah, but I don't think we have any.
the Cinematheque.
The one with film, I don't think we have any nowadays anymore. I don't know.
One comment on, you said that we don't have cinema, but first you said we don't have media and post media. That is two different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, have you ever had more media? So that's one comment, and the other is you said that this difference between digital and not digital images. I mean, this has never been about truth. It's opposite. It's about, I have this, what is the Italian city where they make the movies? I mean, and then it's about mimicking reality. I have always been. So this conscious of this difference between digital and real being behind that fake. I'm a bit curious about the difference.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I say, I think, people will look at Nakai, because that is his claim, right? Is to say, he's not the only one to say it, right? But the fact that you have a photochemical reaction, and that whatever is put in front of a lens is captured on silver halides and reproduced exactly is not even quite representation at that level, right? But an index. But I think a lot of people would say, yeah, this is naive, and of course it's manipulable, and of course it's fantasy, and it's always framed in all of these things. I think part of it comes from Nakai trying to make build a bigger kind of argument for the role of film within a particular kind of historical moment. But I don't disagree with your take. But there are, of course, many arguments that people made a really big deal about the fact that celluloid disappeared and that we just have digital films now. But if I talk to my students, they've never seen a film projected. They can't even address it. We can't talk about it at all as a difference. But for some people, or if you look at experimental film, then celluloid becomes very, very important. Actually, the material of it becomes super important. But I don't disagree with your claim personally. As far as like post-medium condition, it's medium. So yeah, we have endless media, right? But no longer is it a medium in the same sense as Rosalind Krauss's, yeah.
And also, sorry, you're saying that film is not the dominant medium anymore, right? Right. It's, one second, we'll come back to this.
Yeah.
Right, it's like this flow of information that pretends to be free, but is actually that is so much free, right?
No, just to look is to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the act of looking is very different than what I think Nakai envisioned. But yeah,
Also that at his time, in order for you to watch a movie, that's what you're talking about, cinematography as well. The person really needed to stay inside of that space for 30 minutes or 2 hours or something, right? While nowadays I can start watching a movie and watch the first 10 minutes or something and stop doing it and do something else. Watch another film while I'm watching this first film and then come back to the previous film, right? So very different way of, it's not about film, but I saw once, I don't remember who was the person, but he was talking about how musicians used to do music up to like 10 or 15 years ago, that they needed to think the whole album and they had to think like what the order of the songs. But nowadays, like they can only think of one specific song because nobody buys albums anymore. And even if people buy CDs, like the CDs, people don't need to listen to the music in order anymore, right? So each song just becomes like one specific 4 minutes content. It's not about like the whole experience anymore, right? And movies with this digital era, it's not that different anymore, right? Sorry, I don't want to.
I have another very quick question. As someone who wants to read Nakai and I just need to find some access points. Do you find any likeness, any similarities with Krakauer, with Krakauer's writings on movies? I was like thinking of that more than Benjamin because I don't remember someone mentioned probably in Steve's presentation that Nakai, someone considered Nakai as the Benjamin of the
Japan, yeah.
of Japan. So I was like curious if you can
Krakauer,
say more about that, about Krakauer, of course.
yeah, I mean, Krakauer was somebody who wrote, I mean, because actually life is not really a problem typically in film theory,
Right.
right? Realism and things like that are,
Right.
life is something
Right.
that's a little bit askew.
Uh-huh.
But Krakauer is somebody who actually addressed it. But he also, you know, he read films narratively and interpreted their meaning in light of German history, right? So it's like Caligari to Hitler.
Yes.
So in that sense, I would say really, really different
Okay.
from Nakai, who didn't do that at all.
Yeah, but I was
Yeah.
much more curious on the idea of redemption and then because you know you said that Nakai never wrote about never delved into film criticism as others usually did, and so you have the reflections on the blank screen, you have reflections on some
Yeah.
conceptual
Right.
elements in the cinematic language, but so I was like, you know,
Maybe like, yeah, redemption of physical reality. There may be an element of that. It still feels different, but I think that
yeah,
might be,
sure,
I think that might be
but
closer. Yeah, I mean, there are elements of, you know, Benjamin, there are elements of Krakauer. Yeah.
About Benjamin, is one important point of Benjamin's text on movie is the loss of aura.
Yeah.
It's the new technical
Yeah.
art
Yeah.
and produced. So it's related to the Western tradition of this erratic art. Is something similar also in Nakai? What could be the effect of movie to the traditional Japanese aesthetics or art.
I don't think, I don't think he really saw it in terms of kind of loss the way that Benjamin did. I mean, for Benjamin, yeah, but apart from like, faces, there's no aura left after photography, right? Everything has moved from ritual into a kind of economic and political space. And so there's a sense of that kind of loss of a specific, sort of moment in time. Other people like Bart obviously took it the opposite direction. Oh, that's what you have preserved in that kind of living thing. But Nakai, I don't think so. I don't think you have that sense of a loss. I think he saw, film, I think in very positive terms, just offering possibilities for a new collectivity, right? And the fact that there wasn't a copula meant that like it was contingent, that film is radically open and invites the participation and lives through that participation. And so the viewers are already within the film. They're not, at a distance from it. And that's just part of the planning and committee work of a film that has to sort of consider it. That means that they're also embedded within, capitalism, of course, as part of that. So I don't think he was neglecting that. I think that was a factor too. But especially in the post-war, I think he did sort of acknowledge more so kind of risks and problems. But he remained, as far as I know, pretty positive actually about what film could do.
No, I just have two, in fact, just information. Because you mentioned the question for animation, and I was wondering, I've seen something I'd like to. So in Kabe, you have a little mention of animated lanterns.
Okay.
So it's something I have in mind.
Yeah.
So you can have a look at
Okay.
1930.
Kabe. Okay.
Kabe.
Yeah.
He's talking about Somato.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Somato. Okay.
So, yeah, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we might say something like, the UFA, like the stop motion plant, films that he was looking at might loosely be considered kind of in those terms. And I think that his writing on that is pretty interesting. That's because when he gets into temporality and through the use of, this this kind of time that cinema opens up, human time can enter into plant time. And there's, he's writing about things that in the early 30s that I think people aren't going to really address until many decades later. I find that pretty interesting. But it tends to be like a comment and then he moves on. It's not like a long drawn out analysis of like the end of the human or something like that. It's just, okay, this time opens up and then through that human time can enter into plant time. And then something else. And it's like, okay, yeah. But it's there as an idea. I mean, he's drawing a lot on Vertov and Balázs, and other people too, who are, talking about the lens in similar ways, but.
There are questions also, people in Zoom out.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I'm kind of struck at and I never realized this before. There's almost like a dual tendency in his treatment of film. Like on one level, there is, maybe it's not images, but there does seem to be a hyper-specificity when he deals with the medium of film, like with, the logic of the cut. Like he thinks this is like very unique to film that you don't find. And he is very, like if you look in his responses to readers complaining about too much film in Doyobi, he's like, well, this is the art of the moment and we really have to do it. What you said about the Ikerakukan is really, really interesting because that is predicated on film sharing something with, the Kaigan of Fuan, the anxiety, the canvas, right? And it's something that's largely not collective. He's always talking about he's trying to do, basically he's trying to say, Heidegger's Entfernung, like the Kyori, the space, like this new distance that you can take towards and this is something he thinks it shares with painting. So it's interesting because, and maybe this is just like the aesthetic thing, but on the one hand, it's very medium specific. And on the other hand, they're just general commentaries about art. And I'm just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
For me, this is something that I hadn't really realized before, but it's really striking me. So, like I commented.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate, yeah, I do think like, on the one hand, it's obviously, you know, specific and then, but then I feel like if I begin to push on it, then the specificity is no longer rooted necessarily in the material. And that's where that kind of like strange living space comes.
Well,
But it can't be without it.
Can that be anything else other than film? I mean, I said manga earlier, like manga has like a sense of a cut, but that's because it's predicated upon like the film style.
I think with Nakai, it's like because it's tied to so many things, including like a collective, you know, viewing experience and the editing process. And he didn't make a distinction in like talking about Utsusu and things like that between editing and projection. Like those are tied together in that act. And that's a really unusual thing also. Yeah. I mean, I don't know anyone else who wrote about film kind of in that way. I think that's pretty unusual. But it's hard for me to also kind of process because I imagine those as concrete, distinct acts. And I think that his way of approaching it is not to see it that way. And so I don't think like the cut itself in isolation is what's significant. It's everything that it's kind of tied to. And both production and consumption, viewership, movement, masses, all of that is kind of part of it, and rides on it. Yeah. So in that sense, it's specific, but it's not isolated. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Super interesting.
Thank you for interesting presentation. Yeah, animation, I think animation is one of the big topic in Japanese movies. So your presentation was so interesting. And I think Nakai sometimes said lens の物質的視覚 material view of the lens.
Yeah.
And I think he want to distinguish between picture and photograph. And I think he loved photograph because of it is lens capture the real scene,
Right.
only material, only machine, without human beings.
Yeah.
So I think, it is difficult, but I feel that Nakai wants something pure material art without human beings. I feel some like this. This is a big question, but I believe that Nakai loved human beings. Nakai likes human beings, but I feel that he dreamed something, なんていうか material art, machine art, without human beings. So there are ambivalent feelings for the human beings. Nakai's. I think this is some big question.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I don't know, ambivalent. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the write-up of how to, right, and the fact that, he, used a stopwatch and then wrote out, right, this thing. And so it seems like a conversation between two machines, although it's two people doing it. But I find that so weird because on the one hand, yes, it's these kind of two machines in communication, and then he's writing it out through this weird grid, but it's not like cinemetrics or something like that. And at the same time, it's all about the ways that cinema supposedly has a kind of depth of seeing and time and space that are go well beyond what a human being could do. So then I'm like, so what is the function? To this day, I don't really understand the chart and what its real function is. I find it fascinating that he did it. I don't know how he did it. When I watch Spring, it's so fast. The cuts are so fast. I have no idea how he managed to do it or whatever. I know he did it with what's his name? Yeah, Chichibe. But I don't know, but there is a kind of, yeah, tension there, where it's as if there's no human, kind of involved. But I don't know that he ever wrote about it in that way. Like Bazan was like, oh, the photography is the first film that doesn't really need a human being at all, first art form that doesn't need a human being at all. But I don't think that Nakai ever said something like that. But I think of that as an example, where it's sort of like inhuman images and inhuman recording, in conversation with one another.
Yeah, but it couldn't be related to the fact that for him, as far as I understand, the conscience itself has to be pure, like, and it's something that he says very often, as a mirror, as a lens. You know, you have this metaphor in Buddhism very often that conscience, perfect conscience should be, you know, clean like a mirror and nothing attaching to it. So this is very, I mean, the ideal human is to detach from all those things that stick to the image. So becoming like, so you see, you have the pure human that is transparent like a mirror. I don't know.
What would the dust land on? There is no mirror.
What?
There is no mirror. What would the light, there's no place for the dust. There is response to polish the mirror. Because the dust will cloud it. There's nowhere for the dust to land. What are you talking about? That's, I mean, it's the other side of that mirror story, right? That there is no mirror. There's no place for dust. There's no need to dust to polish. That's the other flip side. I mean, I think I see the transformation from early cinematography with its film stock and its lens and the difference between film today that's essentially completely digitalized down to the last detail. I think my sense, my instinct is if I were to say, how does Nakai want to, if Nakai is really import Nakai here, and how would he approach this? If he was consistent, it would be to go back and say, look, what is the type of subjectivity that this medium, this art, this technology is creating? What's the subjectivity? And one of my favorite painters in the European tradition is Giotto. I think Giotto is one of the great geniuses of all time. And the way he opens up the story of the human without actually questioning the Christian story. But you enter into the painting of Giotto. And then when you come out, you see the world in terms of perspective. So you need to enter into a work of art that is the first time, and you have to imagine experiencing that perspective for the first time after seeing all this Christian, primitivism, icon work everywhere where it's flat, blah, and suddenly someone comes out and gives you perspective, and you enter into the work, this particular work. At this historical moment, it's powerful because you enter into this perspective, and then as you turn away from the work of art, you enter into the work of art again. And you see the world now as perspective. And now the Galileo is possible. Now Columbus can sail around the world. Now we can discover. Now we can turn to explore the human. Now we can do all the things that the Renaissance and the modernity are going to do. And the film that he's talking about is a historic moment. It's just this, it's like if you ask Mozart, well, too bad you didn't have some, dissonance in your music. And Mozart would go, what are you talking about? There's dissonance everywhere.
We've become so accustomed to dissonance in our music that we don't even hear how jarring it was, or even Beethoven, how jarring Beethoven was. This is a unique moment. And what type of subjectivity is it creating is, I think, his question.
Right.
But it's still creating a subjectivity that somehow senses there's an objectivity, there's a way of capturing an objectivity, whether it be the physical medium to producing the colors, whether it be the object that has been filmed. There is somehow still a type of subjectivity that's involved, and the cut was disturbing for people. And I was mentioning at lunch, you know, the Russian ark and how that's disturbing. And you watch the Russian ark for a while, and then you go back and you can sense that jarring.
Yeah.
And so that's the experience. It's that moment that this medium is jarring us. And now the question is, what is the subjectivity that this new cinema, this sort of new post-animated, whatever the terminology you want, this new world where everything you're seeing is totally digitalized. There is no connection to anything real. It is entirely a world of fantasy. What type of subjectivity? I think that's the question he would want.
Yeah.
It's not a question of whether this is still film. That's unimportant. No more than saying, is Giotto a painting versus, you know, iconry? Is that a painting? Well, strictly speaking, an icon isn't a painting, it's a writing. So.
And that would be the Ikiru Kukan kind of. Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
The question would be, what is the subjectivity that this new object is producing? We are entering into it, and then when we turn away from it, what are we seeing? What is it, the world that we enter back into? The way when you enter into Giotto, you walk out and now you see the world as perspective. Now you can be Galileo. We enter into this. We exit. What's the world that we're looking at? What is the possibilities that we are now having because of it? That's, I think, the Nakai question. And I think the answer is, it's not a good one. I think that this entrance into this closed world that has no transcendence to it, that is complete fabrication, creates a sense that everything is fabrication. And I think that's the danger of this medium. That doesn't say, you know, we should stop watching and destroy it and stuff like that. I'm not that conservative. But I think it's like every of these mediums. It created a new world, but we're also alienated from the dangers of it. And as philosophers, Nakai would say, I think, figure out what the subjectivity that it's being created here, so that you can understand the world that it's been created and ask yourself some hard questions about that. That's, I think, the question to be asked about these new, not whether, you know, robots talk or have feelings.
I mean, I think that's what both Denson and Levitt are trying to do, is try to understand that form of subjectivity. And my thinking is, what's weird about it is it appears the same. You know that it's not the same. That part of it is kind of weird. We were talking last night. We're like, okay, if Nakai were going to take something up today, I think it would be AI, because that would be something that really threatens to totally turn things upside down. It would be dismissed by a lot of people as trash and so on. The way that film was, I think, when he took it up. But I think that, yeah, like, the weird thing is what you say is true, right? It is a world, and that's what the Levitt piece is saying too. Everything is like a malleable fiction, effectively, no death, etc. Even in biological sciences. Is that true? People still die. I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure that there is. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is kind of an open question, but my intuitive sense is that it doesn't present a radical break, or we would have to sort of isolate that element and understand that as one kind of component that was obviously important for Nakai.
But if Nakai doesn't created a theory of image.
Yeah.
So what if you cannot say what an image is? I think that all this discussion has no soil.
If he can't say what an image is, or if I can't say what an image is.
But back to Nakai, so you or I don't remember, Katie, someone said Nakai, in Nakai writings, there is no explication of what an image is. So
Right.
without the concept of image, which kind of theory of movie or painting can you do? I think it's a very important missing point that would be Steve said the answer would be there is this problem, the answer would be, but without the concept of image, which kind of answer can you find?
I mean, Nakai was using the term easel, which is a little bit unusual at the time. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, that term became popular for a different reason because the media situation was changing, et cetera, et cetera. He's one of the few people to use it as this term for a technical image. But I don't know that he addressed it all that kind of extensively. Yeah, that's why I mean, for this president is why I'm sort of emphasizing the bare wall and the bare screen. Those are material things. It's not nothing, but nothing is projected on it.
It is interesting because Tosaka Jun talks a lot about Eizo, like, isn't this Furuhata Yuko's point? Like,
Right, for actuality.
Yeah, for the cinema of actuality, like, so it wouldn't be that he doesn't know that he should think about image, so I mean, that kind of adds like an additional complexity to it.
Yeah, I mean, Tosaka wrote really fascinating essays on film. And he did emphasize materiality, and the kind of joy of materiality that cinema makes available. But in a way that Nakai didn't. But it was like, Fuzoku, right, would come through and something like film, it would be captured in that sense that there would be material element. And so you could grasp that kind of dimension of life and everyday life, through something like film. It would make that visible. It would make it public. You could see it.
So I think we are perfectly in time to close our.